Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to my Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement and your host for these series. We're in for a really special treat today. Ellen Langer is back. I interviewed her actually a few years ago at the beginning of COVID, and it was really interesting to have her perspective on all of her mindfulness work then as we were dealing with COVID, which ended up lasting much more longer than any of us expected. Well, let me tell you real briefly about Ellen, and then we're going to get started focusing on her new book, The Mindful Body, Thinking Our Way to Chronic Health. Dr. Ellen Langer was the first woman to be tenured in psychology at Harvard, where she's still a professor of psychology. The recipient of 3 Distinguished Scientist Awards, the Arthur V.W. Statz Award for Unifying Psychology, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Liberty Science Genius Award. Dr. Langer is the author of 12 other books, including the international bestseller Mindfulness, as well as The Power of Mindful Learning, Counterclockwise, on Becoming an Artist. And there's another book called On Noticing, which is a wonderful book that combines some of her kind of quotes with some of her own art, which is quite a lovely book. Her trailblazing experiments in social psychology have earned her inclusion in the New York Times Magazine's Year in Ideas issue. She's known worldwide as the mother of mindfulness and the mother of positive psychology. Her primary residence is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she also lives nearby where I have a residence too, in South Dartmouth, Massachusetts. We were just talking about that before we started the call. I really want to welcome you here, Ellen, and to just say I'm happy to have you again. And I've now read her book, which, to let everybody know, it's going to be coming out on September 5th. I totally recommend this book. In fact, I was so excited about it. I was telling people in one of my book groups about it, and we've chosen it to be our book for this coming month since it's going to be available at the beginning of the month. So I think what you've accomplished, Ellen, is it's like a tour de force in a sense. You pulled together all of your work, but with some additional depth and thoughts about how we really end up at times being our own worst enemies in terms of how our thinking becomes toxic and actually can play into us being more ill than we need to be. And I love the idea of thinking our way into chronic health instead of focusing on chronic illness. There's so much to talk about. I know we only have 1 hour. So tell us a little, if you would, about why this book now. I'll add that I know from reading it that you had said you were starting off as a memoir, and then it morphed into a different book, although you share more about yourself in it. So tell us a little about why now and what your goal was about this book.
My goal for this book is really the same as all my other mindfulness books. I believe that this is the cure that we need in the world, not just for any of us in South Dartmouth or the United States, that if we can become more mindful, and this new book, by the way, presents data showing that our mindfulness is contagious. So we don't need to all read the book, but if enough of us read it, learn how to be mindful, everything will change for us. It's been, as you mentioned, over 40 years of research where we find this very simple thing. It's so simple it almost defies belief that all you need to do is actively notice new things about the things you think you knew. And what happens at that point is that the neurons start firing, and the research has made clear it's literally and figuratively enlivening. And the reason we don't do that is because we had been taught when we were younger by our parents and schools, every time you read something, we're taught absolutes. We're taught certainties. And when you know something for certain, you don't pay any attention. Why should you? And if you knew what I was going to say next, you'd be better off doing something else. But it turns out because everything is always changing and everything looks different from different perspectives. We don't know. No matter who I'm talking to, whether it's people of our age or young people, I often start and I just ask, how much is 1 and 1? And at this point, this is the one thing that everybody's sure they know. So they think I'm foolish for asking. So they obediently say 2. And then I inform them, no, if you're adding 1 pile of laundry plus 1 pile of laundry, 1 plus 1 is 1. If you add 1 cloud plus 1 cloud, 1 plus 1 is 1. If you add 1 wad of chewing gum and 1 wad of chewing gum, 1 plus 1. In the real world, 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2 as often as it does. So if the thing we're most certain of turns out we don't know as well as we thought, then perhaps people will be a little more open to the idea that there's nothing that we know that we can be sure of. Now, that shouldn't scare us. That makes everything new and potentially exciting. And by recognizing that we don't know, then we tune in. And when we tune in, we reap all of the benefits that this 45 years of research has made clear. We're happier, we're more engaged, it's good for our health. We've done studies where people even live longer when we make them more mindful. People like us more because we're more charismatic. And not only that, but it leaves its imprint on the things that we do. There's no excuse in some sense once you know all of the advantages. There's no drawback. Sometimes I tell people you should be mindful virtually all the time, and they shudder because they confuse being mindful with thinking. And thinking has gotten a bad rap. Thinking also is fun. But what's not fun is worrying that we're not going to be able to think correctly about something, or that we're going to be consumed with negative thoughts. That's not being mindful. Being mindful is just noticing, and as you do this, it puts you in the present, and then you're able to take advantage of opportunities to which you'd otherwise be blind and avoid dangers that not yet arisen. You ask about the new book. The new book reviews some of the research that I've done over the years, but goes, as you suggested nicely, deeper into much of it. And then there's a lot of brand new research. And the main draw of this book is the realization that mind and body are one. It's not connected. It used to be thought that mind and body were 2 separate things. And then most of the world says, okay, mind-body connection. I'm not talking about a connection because then you get into questions like how were they connected? I'm talking about the advantages of seeing it as a single unit. And what that means is then wherever you put your mind, you're necessarily putting your body, which gives us enormous control over our health and well-being. And that's what I pursue in this new book.
So tell us more about that, because in part, as you say, people can step back and get paralyzed and say, oh my God, how do I deal with all this newness? And you have such wonderful insight that you bring into the book about how decisions are made. And so much of your book is really dealing with uncertainty, which, as you say, is part of the world. So tell us more about that. Yeah.
Uncertainty is a good thing. And what we want to do is exploit the power of uncertainty. Now, sometimes people get scared by not knowing. They get scared by not knowing basically for 2 reasons, where they think they should know and that somebody else knows and they're going to look stupid. And I'm telling you, nobody knows. You can't know for sure because everything is always changing. Second is that once you recognize that outcomes, the good and bad of things, are in our heads, they're not in events, which means the more mindful you are, the more able you are to see the advantage in whatever it is. I've had a lifetime of experiences where one might shudder at some of the things that have happened. Let me tell you that one story. It's probably too long. I should choose another, but I'm going to tell you this. Many years ago, I had a major fire that destroyed about 80% of what I owned. So that would seem to be terrible, right? I called the insurance company, and this is the first interesting part. The person came the next day and said this was the first time in his 25 years at this job that the damage was worse than the call. Meaning somebody goes, oh my God, and the damage was great, but my reaction wasn't because I had already lost whatever had been burned. Why throw my sanity after it? I moved into the Charles Hotel because I didn't have a place to live, and it was around Christmas. This was I can't tell you how beautiful this was in the middle of all of the seemingly negative stuff. I go out for Christmas Eve. I come back to my hotel room, and it's full of gifts, not from the CEO, the manager, the person who owned the hotel, but from the little people, the people who parked my car, the chambermaids, the waiters and waitresses. It's only recently that I'm able to talk about that without it bringing tears to my eyes. Every Christmas, I'm reminded about the basic of strangers, of people. And I don't remember virtually anything that I lost in the fire. Was it good or bad? I'm not suggesting people experience fires, but even in things that are tragic, seem tragic, there's a way to appreciate what's going on. In fact, much of the misery that people experience will go away if they simply ask themselves when something happens, is it a tragedy or an inconvenience? Because except for fires and things of this sort, it's almost always just an inconvenience. And then you say how crazy you're going to get because you missed a deadline, you burnt a roast, or whatever things that to get us stressed. So in this book, what I do is talk about stress, decision-making, risk-taking, things that I think people have gotten wrong that cause them unhappiness before I go into all of the health work. And you raise the question about decision-making. I'm just going to throw out a little. I don't know if in this short time I can make all this clear to people, but 3 things. The first is that we make decisions based on predictions, right? If I do this thing, it's going to happen, but if I do that other thing, that's going to happen. Turns out prediction is an illusion. Kirk was the first person that I had read who had said, we live our lives going forward, but we understand it looking back. Going forward, you have no idea what's going to happen. Looking back, sure, we make a nice causal inference. So you see Tom and Susie fighting at a party. If you were asked right then, are they going to get divorced? You'd say, who knows, right? People fight. If you didn't go through that and somebody says to you, oh, I heard Tom and Susie are getting divorced, you say, I knew it, which of course you didn't, because you saw them at the party. When you recognize you can't predict, then even the thought of making decisions doesn't make full sense. Now, when we make a decision, people think they should do a cost-benefit analysis. And what I said a moment before is when you recognize that the outcomes of anything you're doing are neither good nor bad, we create that evaluation. So this thing is both good and it's bad. So if you add it up, it's not going to tell you what to do. Not only that when you're gathering information to make a decision, there's no endpoint to how much information you could gather. And I imagine that most of your listeners are pretty smart people. Those of us are pretty smart. We can just keep going because almost everything is going to be potentially relevant. That's not going to help us make a decision. People have to read to really understand what I'm saying. But let me give you the bottom line, which is I think it's a waste of time trying to make the right decision. Instead, what we should do, make the decision right. So
say that again, because I think I just think it's really important, and I underscored it in the book. So say it,
yeah.
Please.
Rather than try to make the right decision, we should spend our time making the decision right. Whatever happens has an advantage. Whatever happens, we can do in a way that's fun, interesting, meaningful. And that's one of that and understanding the illusion of prediction and predictability and understanding outcomes are neither good nor bad. All of that together, and you end up with a life that's reasonably stress-free. And if you just think about it, to be stressed, 2 things are happening. You're assuming that something is going to happen. We just said you can't predict. And second, that when it happens, it's going to be awful. We just said nothing in itself is awful or good or whatever, independent of the way we understand it. Next time you stress, give yourself 3 reasons why this thing probably won't happen. So you went from thinking it's definitely going to happen to maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. So you're immediately a little more relaxed. Then second, ask yourself, what is the advantage if it does happen? And there's always an advantage. It all depends on how creative you are and how willing you are to think about the situation differently. And the more mindful we are, the easier it is for us to turn things around and notice whatever we're looking at from different perspectives. Okay, now, and it's very important for people to reduce the stress that they experience, because stress, I believe, actually is the major culprit in all disease. Now, I don't have data for this particular statement that I'm going to make, but still I believe it. That if we were to take people who were just diagnosed with some dread disease, let's say cancer, something they would fear, then no one at that moment is going to be stress-free. Everyone is going to be upset. But then let's wait 3 weeks, and let's go back to all these people and see how stressed they are, and measure their stress every few weeks or every month. I believe that stress over and above nutrition, genetics, medical treatment, that stress will determine the outcome of their disease.
Can you elaborate on that, please? Yeah. Go ahead.
What? Okay, I'm saying that stress is bad. And that what we need to understand is stress is a psychological concept. And so then we can use our minds to reduce that stress. And as we're reducing the stress, we're going to be improving our health. Now, some of the work that is in this book that aside from the things I've just mentioned that happened in other books of mine, are the research studies on mind-body unity. Because again, once you have the mind and body as one thing, you can see how those stressful thoughts are just not doing good things for our physical selves. People might know the counterclockwise study. That was the first test of mind-body unity. And the reason I can presume, I can even call it a famous study, is because if you tune in to put on The Simpsons Go to Havana, turns out they talk about the study. Okay, so it's out there. But just briefly, what I did was retrofitted a retreat to 20 years earlier and had old men, live there as if they were their younger selves. So they would be discussing the past in the present tense and in all ways being their younger selves. As a result, just a week of living in this past as if it's the present, their vision improved, their hearing improved, their memory improved, their strength improved, and they looked noticeably younger. And all of that without any medical intervention. Okay, so now, fast forward, we have so many studies, I don't know how many I should tell you. Let me just choose 2. The next study we did in that series was with chambermaids. So we found out, interestingly, that chambermaids don't realize all the exercise they're getting because they think exercise, based on what the Surgeon General says, is what you do after work. And after work, they're just too tired. The study is so simple. We divide them into 2 groups. We take one group, and we're going to teach them that their work is exercise. Making a bed is like working at this machine at the gym, and so on. Okay, all we've done is change their mindset to now work is exercise. Now, we take lots of measures before and after. We find these people aren't working any harder. They're not eating any differently. All that's changed is now their minds see their work as exercise. As a result of this, they lost weight. There was a change in waist to hip ratio, body mass index, and their blood pressure came down. So I have lots of these studies, which are fun and surprising. Let me tell you about the most recent, where we inflict a wound. Now, I don't want to hurt people, and even if I did, the review board wouldn't let me do such a study. So it's a minor wound, to be sure, but a wound nonetheless. We have one group of people. It's 3 groups. The first group that has this wound is in front of a clock that's going half as fast as real time. The second group is in front of a clock that's going twice as fast as real time. And the third group is in front of a clock that's real time. The question we're asking is, would that wound heal based on perceived time, which means clock time, or real time? And it turns out that it's based on perceived time. You think the time has gone by faster, you heal more quickly. We have studies with diabetes and lots of different disorders, and we keep finding the same thing over and over again. There's something else that I talk about in the book that is new that I find interesting that also lends support to the mind-body unity idea. It's what I call the borderline effect. So the simplest way is imagine, Dory, you took an IQ test and I took one, and you get a 70, so you're normal, and I get a 69, so I'm not. I'm cognitively deficient, what we used to call retarded. Okay. Nobody in their right mind, knowing you don't have to know anything about statistics, would think there's a meaningful difference between 69 and 70, right? I could have sneezed and misread a question. However, go forward 3-4 months, and we're going to be entirely different in very real ways after that. You're going to treat yourself, and people are going to treat you as if you're normal, quite the opposite from me. Okay, we look at cancer and diabetes, and we take some measures where we look at measures where some people fall right below and others right up, whatever the measurement is that would say you have it and I don't, or I have it, you don't, but we're right there. We're not different. At that moment, it's just like the 69 and 70. So we follow these people, and over time, what happens, people who were not different when at the beginning now show a very strong difference and manifest the symptoms of the disease. And that can only be because of their psychology. So I have lots of these studies, lots of these thoughts, all telling me that we have so much more control over our health and being than people realize. That's why I keep writing these books. I want to shout on the roof, please stop hurting yourself. And then we have a method to deal with whatever illnesses we have. It's also useful for stress, chronic, these are some of the populations we've done this with are, Parkinson's, arthritis, chronic pain, stress, depression, multiple sclerosis, stroke, big things, right? Yeah. And so all of these start off with the view when people get a diagnosis of some chronic illness, they believe the symptoms are going to stay the same or get worse. Nothing moves in only one direction. There are moments when it's actually a little better, a little worse. So what we do is get people to tune in to those moments when it's a little better. We call them periodically. How are you now? Is it better or worse than before? And here's the key. Then we ask them, and why? By searching for the why, 3 things happen. The first is you're going to be mindful. That means the neurons are firing, and that's good for your health. Second, by recognizing the variability, you immediately feel better because you thought you were stressed all the time, depressed all the time, in pain all the time, and gee, you're not. But most important, I think, is that when you believe there is a solution, you're more likely to look for it. We call people, they notice. Let me give you an example. Let's say, Dory, you're stressed all the time. So the argument is, no one is anything all the time. All right. You call periodically. I can call you periodically. How are you now? Are you more or less stressed than the last time we spoke? And why? And we do this enough times, and you know what will happen? You'll say, oh my goodness, I'm really stressed when I'm talking to Ellen Langer and not when I'm not talking to her. So then the solution is easy, right? Don't talk to me. All right. So the point of this is, again, that we have control that we don't realize we have. And people don't realize that possibly the strongest medicine that's out there is the placebo. So you take this pill that is a sugar pill. It's inert by definition. And then all of a sudden you get better. It's not the pill that's making you better. What's making you better? You're making yourself better. And so this attention to symptom variability that I just described is the way for us to do this, to make ourselves better. Now, you don't need somebody to call you. All of us have smartphones. So set the smartphone to ring in an hour and ask yourself, how is it now, better or worse than before, and why? And then set it for 45 minutes, then set it for 3 hours, and so on. And over time, what will happen is, again, by looking for why, you're going to be more mindful, so you're going to end up feeling better. and looking for a solution, looking for the why, you're more likely to find it than just mindlessly assuming I'm going to be stuck with these symptoms, with this chronic illness for the rest of my life.
I love that part of the noticing the variability is so important because, as you say, it isn't true that it's either going to just be downhill or be static, and I really do think people lose sight of that. So I think your book has so many valuable pieces. I just also want to just remind people who are on the call, you can go to the event page if you want to ask questions and just say who you are, where you're from, and I'll try to integrate those questions if we can, if there's time.
Yes, I think something that's useful for people to know is that our expectations that we've mindlessly incorporated are causing big trouble for us. And that so when you're younger and somebody says, as you get older, you fall apart. Let's say a 25-year-old hurts their wrist. What they're going to do is do things to make it better because they assume their wrist isn't supposed to hurt. I'm 76. If I bought into that mindset that I'm going to fall apart, when my wrist hurts, I said, what do you expect? I'm getting older, so of course I'm falling apart. And so then, because I don't take care of it, it does get worse, but not because I'm 76, only because I didn't assume, I didn't expect that it would get better. And that's what we have to do throughout our lives is live as if we're our younger selves. I have a family member of my marriage who's 99 who is out and about. If she went to the dentist the other day and needed a crown, and the question was, she going to go for the cheap version or the expensive version? And the dentist almost thought we should do this inexpensive procedure because after all, she's 99. And we all went crazy. And she said, no, I want the full treatment. And I just read yesterday about this woman who made her own birthday cake. And there's a picture of it that's on the internet, 112 years old. We never know how long we're going to live. And I think that most important, sometimes people try to add more life to their years. I think the key is to add more, they want to add more years to their lives. And the key is to add more life to your years. And by being fully present, by being mindful and engaged, what happens is we tend to live longer lives. But regardless, we're living happier lives, healthier lives.
And you mentioned in your book, and I know I've mentioned to people on these calls, the study of Becca Levy, who I know was one of your students. And you alluded to it before, too, that people live 7.5 years longer with a more positive attitude about aging without internalizing so much of this negative ageist toxicity. There's so many things in your book that are so wonderful. Talk a little about how scarcity versus abundance plays in, because I think it's an underlying part, I think, to some of what you're saying, but I think it makes such a difference.
Yeah, I think that when you think in terms of scarcity, that's when, as we get older, we think, I don't have many years left. And you can't know that. And there are people, sadly, at 30, 20, get hit by a car or die suddenly or have protracted illnesses. And then people who are living very long lives. And again, I think that we prosper by having the expectation for a long and healthy life. But you don't walk around expecting these things and just living your life as if you're who you always were. And that's the best thing for you. When we talk about scarcity, give me an example of what I gave as an example in the book, because you're more current in it than I am.
Oh,
remind me. What
I need to go back to.
You can't do. Okay,
I'm not going to be so quick.
It's all right. Please say that maybe one thing, I don't know if I have this in the book or not, is that many people live their lives as if whatever they're doing is zero sum, which means you win, that means I lose, or I win means you lose, which is a ridiculous way of viewing things. That for the things that matter in the world, it's not zero sum. There is no scarcity in the possibility, the ability to function at a high level, to be pleased with oneself, and to be interested in the world around them. But I think that even in there, people talking about limited resources, forgetting that who decides what's a resource? that if we open up our view of what resources are, then we diminish that there are limits. Let's both read that part of my book for the next time we talk.
The other part that hit me that I have underlined, I did find the chapter again, was I really liked your concept about so often we say, oh, just try harder. And so maybe speak about that because, yeah.
There's so much that we reveal in our language that people are oblivious to. That first, before I talk about try, and you remind me if I was giving a talk to about 5,000 people with cancer. And and this man was there, and his wife died of cancer, and he attacked me, but reasonably, I wasn't clear enough. He said, am I blaming the victim? And I said, because I'm suggesting we have control over even these dreaded diseases. And then I said, the culture doesn't teach us that we have this control, then of course we're not to blame for not knowing it, which is why I run around giving these talks and writing these books. But then he said, and I'm wrong, his wife fought the disease. And so I thought about fighting the disease. Now, if you're on your pants, would you see yourself as fighting the 2-year-old? So there was a way that the metaphor, fighting cancer, suggests you already believe this thing is enormous and you're not going to be able to beat it.
Right.
And in a not dissimilar way, trying. It's so funny. People try to do something. Would you try to eat an ice cream cone? You don't try. You just do it, right? The very idea, the thought that you have of you're trying suggests that you don't think you're going to succeed. And again, our expectations rule. If you don't think you're going to succeed, it's much harder to succeed than if we don't ask the question in the first place, or we just presume that we will succeed. Right. And success is something interesting also, because what does success mean? If I were a golfer and I mistakenly thought that success, maximal success, would be that hole in one every time I swung the golf club, it'd be bad, because if that were the case, then there's no game. So we don't really want the complete success. And if you think you want complete success, play tic-tac-toe against the 4-year-old. You'll always win. But that's not what we want. We want the challenge. And so I think that what we need to do is engage what we're engaging, notice the ways it's new, let ourselves go full out without worrying about passing, failing, somebody else giving us a disparaging look, and so on. Because the game is mastering, not having mastered. And as people have said before me, it's the journey, not the destination. And the journey, if it's mind engaged, doesn't matter where you're intending to go, you're going to be successful.
And that ties in to the focus that you have about growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And that's part of what I was thinking of when I was asking also about the scarcity and abundance, that if you talk about it.
Yeah. Well, Carol Dweck talks about a growth mindset, which is just being mindful. That if you believe that you can't do it, you're not going to do it. It's really not more complicated than that. And we can never provide evidence. No, you can't do an experiment to show that you can't do it, whatever the it is. All you can do is show, if you were to do it as an experiment, that what you tried didn't work. You can't know that you can't, and doing is such fun. And doing it expertly is, if that means doing it perfectly, then you're going to be mindless again. Don't seek that perfection. That what we want to do is know that there's always some other way of doing it, whatever the it is. And and that in that doing, growth will manifest itself. You're either growing or you're dying. And that means you're noticing things, or the body is turning itself off by being mindless.
You talk about yourself as being... Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Say again?
No, yeah.
Yeah. Well, right. Before I say what I was going to say, let me integrate a question from our listeners. Jackie from Ann Arbor says, I love the mindful approach to life. However, we're in a world divided by class, race, gender, etc., which subjects us to differential types of stress, such as discrimination and unequal opportunity. How will mindfulness be beneficial to an impoverished single mother of color who loses her job, becomes homeless with her young children?
Yeah, okay. So in 3 minutes, let me solve that problem. No, for sure. Something that the caller makes me think of that's very important is that everything that we experience was put there by other people. Now, that makes everything mutable when you realize that it's person created. The problem is the more different you are from the person who created it, the more important it is that you don't do it their way. So let me step back and I'll eventually answer the question. When I lecture on this, sometimes I'll look in the audience and see if there's a big guy out there. And I ask him to come to the stage. Somebody who's 6'5", if I can find him. He comes to the stage. I'm 5'3". We look ridiculous standing next to each other. Then I ask him to put his hand up, and I put my hand up next to him. And his hand is 3 inches bigger than mine. And I simply raise the question, should we do anything physical the same way? It seems ridiculous. Okay, if people like him decided how we should do whatever that physical thing is, I'm going to be at a loss. My favorite example, I still play tennis. And when you play tennis, you get 2 serves. Okay, so I throw the ball up, I hit it hard, it doesn't go in. I'm playing doubles. Then I have a wuss second serve. If I wrote the rules, you'd have 3 serves. The first one you throw up, you try to kill it, you miss. Then you have another one where you can try to kill it, so you actually learn from the first. And then you still have the wuss, so you don't double fault follow up. Now, what I'm suggesting is that if I designed the rules to the game, I would be a better tennis player. All right? I'm not less good than this other person. I'm just different because I'm shorter, my hands are smaller, whatever the case may be. If you're a black woman living in a white world, do it your own way because the way it was decided, whatever it is, was probably by some white man. If you're a woman, this is more important for you to know. Most important is when you feel disparaged, I think, is to recognize and feel sorry for the person who is, in some sense, leading you to this feeling. Nobody has it together, behaves that way. And I think we make a big mistake with bullies. And bullies can be in school when you're young or throughout our lives. People say to the child, don't bully someone. You shouldn't pick on people who are weaker than you are. And that makes the bullying more because you're so strong. If you told the child that only weak people bully, there'd be no incentive to do the bullying. If you're acting in some obnoxious way with me, as if you're on high, rather than feel bad about myself, I tend to feel sorry for you. Because you wouldn't be, no guru, nobody we respect who has it together does that to other people. That's number one. Number two is that no matter what anybody says to us, our behavior makes sense when we engage in it or else we wouldn't do it. And that what we need is to have our own understanding of why we've done what we've done. For example, Dorian, you might not like me because I'm gullible. From my perspective, I'm trusting. I might not like you because you're so damn inconsistent. That's because from your perspective, you're being flexible. It turns out each and every negative understanding we have of somebody's behavior has an equally strong but oppositely balanced alternative. For every negative thing you call me, there's a positive way of viewing it. Nobody can make us feel any of the things that this person is talking about. Now, how to get by? Once our basic needs are met, and it's a whole different answer and a whole different book as to that particular sort of case. How do we change the culture, which I'm very much in favor of because there's enough food for everybody to eat. Nobody should ever have to go hungry. But once you've met those basic needs, how to be happy? Just be engaged in whatever you're doing. I spent a lot of time in Mexico, and I'm amazed at these people. They had really nothing. They work so hard, and they're always smiling. And I come back from the winter that I spend there, and I'm in Cambridge, liberal Cambridge, and I say, good morning, good afternoon, because everybody in Mexico does. Everybody looks at me like I'm crazy. So how much do you have to have in order to be living a satisfying life? I think not nearly as much as most of us think. But if you think you can't think well of yourself unless you're very wealthy, that's a different story. But if you examine and are able to interview many of those billionaires, you'd find that most of them are not very happy. As the Beatles said, money can't buy you love, self-love. I don't know if I've answered. I've talked a lot. I must have said something remotely interesting, but I don't remember the question well enough to know if I've met her needs.
What you've said is very interesting. I think the question really talks about basically the inequities. Yeah.
No,
right.
but there are inequities, but that's
right.
like the scarcity idea we were talking about a moment before. Do I have less or do those people? So I'm talking about, say, a worker in Mexico where I live in the winter who doesn't have any money, doesn't eat fancy food, can't afford a taxi, taking a bus and so on. And here I am. I have a car and I'm able to have a nice meal and so on. That inequity, is that what's important? Or we look, not at me because I'm a happy camper, but we look at so many people I know who have all these luxuries and are depressed.
Right.
So who's better off? This person who has seemingly nothing, who's happy, or this person who has seemingly everything, who doesn't think well of themselves and is depressed most of the time? To me, I'd say that I'd rather be that worker.
So I'm going to shift it a little bit of the role of imagination, because you talk about body cognition, and as you said, that your mindfulness can be contagious, but also you've got some wonderful sections on the role of imagination, like imagined eating or imagined getting better or imagined. Talk some about that.
If we go back to the mind-body unity idea, and we recognize that everything we're thinking is having some effect on our bodies, wow, that opens up so many avenues. Somebody else, I don't remember whom, I thought it in the book, did this research where they had people imagine their exercise, I think it was flexing their arms or whatever, versus really doing the exercise versus a group that did neither. And both the imagined exercise and the real, so to speak, exercise, the positive effects, not dissimilar from our chambermaid study. Our thoughts are so important to our health and being and fully under our control. You don't have to think anything, but every time you think something negative, if you just say to yourself, what's another way of turning this around? Every time you say, I can't, ask yourself, how do you know you can't? And it's interesting that in one book I talked about Zeno's paradox with respect to distance. Zeno was a Greek philosopher, and I thought, what a cynic this guy was, must have been. That he says, and rightly, if you always go half the distance from where you are to where you want to be, you'll never get there. I'm an inch away, then I'm a half an inch away, then I'm a quarter of an inch away, an eighth of an inch, 60. You're never going to get this. Okay, let's turn this around. And there's Langer's reversing those paradox. There is always a step that one can take that gets them closer to where they want to be. So let's say you have a weight problem and you eat a box of cookies a night and you want to stop eating the box of cookies. Okay, so eat a half a box. You can't not eat a half a box. You want to eat more. You eat a quarter less. Eat a third. Everybody can eat a few crumbs less. And in that, then we have a different starting point, all right, and slowly work our way up. And I did this years ago with when I was consulting in this nursing home with the people there. What is it that you'd like to do that you can't do? And let's pick something out. And this woman whose arm was paralyzed felt it embarrassing to have somebody blow her nose for her. And so I did this. I said, okay, raise your arm. Which of course she couldn't because she believed it was paralyzed. And then I kept lowering the distance that I was asking her to raise her arm to until we got to a tiny little space. And she was able to meet that. And we kept doing this. And it didn't happen instantly. But at the end of this, she was, not the end of the day, but she was able to blow her nose. And when I first wrote about this, I said, I know so many people who are reading this are going to say she wasn't really paralyzed then. And I say to that, okay, first, how many of us are misdiagnosed in that way? Think we have something that perhaps we don't have. And I still believe that even with something like being paralyzed, no matter what the ailment we have, there are always things we can do to help ourselves. And when we say a disease is incurable, the disease isn't incurable. It's just we haven't figured out how to cure it. And the simplest thing we should be doing if we ever get one of these diagnoses that scare us, is to make the rest of us strong, the rest of our body. If you have an image, we'll go back to the COVID that you started this discussion with, have an image of an Olympic runner and contrast her with somebody who is eating chocolate, which I love, watching television, which I love, but this is what she's doing all day long in her bathroom, can't even bother. So she's a mess, basically. And you say, if both of those people, this is a thought experiment, if both of those people were going to get COVID, who do you think would be better prepared to deal with it? Who do you think would have the easier time with it? And I think the Olympic runner, suggesting we become Olympic athletes, but that we can always make ourselves stronger. And if we do that, and we follow the attention to symptom variability that I mentioned before, which is the code word for being mindful, just notice when we're a little better, ask ourselves why, then many of these seemingly incurable diseases, I think, will, something that we didn't touch on, but I make believe you're asking me now, how did I get into all this, mind-body unity? And I was married when I was very young, and so I went to Paris on my honeymoon. And now I was a woman of the world. After all, I was married. And I ordered this mixed grill at this restaurant, and on the mixed grill was pancreas. And my then husband, I asked him which of those things was the pancreas. He was more sophisticated than I, and he said that. Okay, I'm a big eater. I eat everything else with gusto. Now the moment of decision. Would I be able to eat that pancreas? I was determined. I start eating it, and I'm getting really sick. I'm visibly nauseated. He starts laughing. I say, why are you laughing? He said, because that's chicken. You ate the pancreas ages ago. Okay, I'm getting sick because I think it's a pancreas, even though it's chicken, which I eat all the time. All right, my thoughts made me sick. Okay, now, fast forward a while, something much more important. My mother is diagnosed with breast cancer, and the cancer metastasizes to her pancreas. That's the end game. All right, pancreatic cancer. One day, it was just magically gone. The medical world cannot explain spontaneous remissions. The mind-body unity theory can. And I think that they're much more prevalent than most people in the medical world would lead us to believe, because I think many of us have tumors that we don't know that we have, and then the tumor goes away, that we didn't even know we had it, how we know that it went away. There are people who never go to the medical world, so they don't find out that they have these tumors, and the medical world doesn't find out that those went into remission. And I think that if we recognize that perhaps even with these dread diseases, there's a chance for it to heal, again, our expectations lead us to behave differently. You think you're going to die, turn the system off. You don't go out, you're depressed, and you don't do those things that are life-giving. And it's, again, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the medical world doesn't mean anything bad by it, but let me tell you, I have this friend who had a very bad case of cancer. And I saw her one day, and I said, Eva, how are you? Because I knew she just came back from Mass General. She was being examined. And she said, her cancer's in remission. And at that moment, a light went off for me. If I had the very same test that had the very same results, they would tell me I don't have cancer. Why are they telling her she has cancer in remission? Once you think it's in remission, you feel better than it's active, but you still worry, you're stressed that it's still there. Now, if you have a cold and you get over the cold, you don't see your cold as in remission. And when you get another cold, it's the same as the first cold, because that's why you call them both colds, but in some ways it's also different. And you're less frightened of it because, after all, you've beaten hundreds of colds, so you'd be capable of beating the one that you're currently experiencing. I suggest that when cancer is no longer there, we see ourselves as cured. If it should come back, it's not the same cancer, it's a new cancer, and we should feel we beat it the first time, we can beat it again. We interviewed women who were on a breast cancer awareness walk and asked them whether they saw their cancers as in remission or cured. And they said, then we compared the two groups. We did follow-up studies 6 months later, and it turned out that those who saw their cancer as cured were better both physically and psychologically on all the measures that we took. So again, it's like what you were saying before about trying. There are certain words that sound positive but have a negative undertone, and we want to be sensitive to that so we can approach life with a smile and an expectation that all will be good. And that goes a long way and makes all good.
Well, you talk about having mindful optimism, which I think is...
Yeah. During COVID, there were lots of people who I saw who had this attitude that's called defensive pessimism. And defensive pessimism, I'm sure some of the people listening to us now are defensive pessimists, is prepare for the worst but hope for the best. And I find that scary because if you're prepared for the worst, you're setting yourself up to expect the worst and in some ways create the worst. And I think that what we want to do is take whatever measures, as with COVID, then it was washing your hands, wearing them, and staying away from large groups, and then just go about your business. And what happens then is you're building a stronger self so that should you get COVID, you're going to be better able to deal with it. Expecting the worst, you end up getting the worst. And because events are not good or bad, so if you're expecting the worst, you're saying the bad. And that's depressing and that's stressful, and they tend to wear the system down.
Such excellent points.
So the point is, I'm not saying to be a mindful optimist means denying anything. There's no denial. There's just a way of being, and that focusing on negative things, negative repercussions, and people are often oblivious to it.
Yeah. It's tied into, I think, the growth mindset also, of really thinking in a more expansive way of the positive. It's tied in some respects to the cognitive approach, which is trying to really get rid of some of these negative distortions that create self-fulfilling processes.
In cognitive behavior modification 40 years ago. And the difference, so I'm very much in favor of taking a situation and reframing it. The mindful approach goes one step further, which is recognizing there are multiple frames. I often thought somebody goes to a therapist and the therapist says, maybe it's why. And then the person then buys what the therapist has said as their understanding of the situation. When there are 5, 10, 20 other potential interpretations, and coming up with these is not only engaging, but tells us that any one belief we have may be less likely than we thought. Yes, we have the capacity to reframe, and you do this often enough that over time, I don't reframe things to something positive. It doesn't occur to me that it's negative in the first place.
Yeah.
But surely, if we have an experience, a fire that I mentioned, my mother's illness, death, actually, that things happen, and that when they happen, the way we talk to ourselves about it is going to determine our immediate and then potentially longer-term future. And we have the control, the capacity to tell ourselves many different stories, one not more true than the other, but it might have a very different psychological effect on us.
I wish I could go on talking with you for hours, because we even said at the beginning before we started that there's so much in this book, but I really do want to honor your time and the time and know we need to stop. One area that I didn't even get into at some other time is just how you're attempting to maybe educate the medical community or the mental health community. And
I think that this is, we'll take just another minute. It's very important. Somebody asked me, am I getting much pushback from the medical world? And oddly, not at all. They know they don't know. And if we know that they don't know, then we can partner in our health care. Medical science, like all science, only gives us probabilities, not absolutes. That says that when you're given a diagnosis, it's amazing. It's not you have cancer. You have this thing that we think we're going to call cancer, that we think is going to go in this particular direction. When we take it as absolute, then again, those expectations determine what's going to happen. And if that's negative, it's sad because we could have seen it in other ways. So yes, we want to train the medical world. We want to free the medical world to acknowledge that they don't know and still respect their opinion. We want to be more active in our own health care. And I also, in the book, talk about a very different kind of hospital that I think we all prosper from its creation and so on. It's hard for me when I do these calls and these podcasts because there's so much I want to share. But I thank you so much for telling people that there's a lot there, and I wish everybody good health and mindful life.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ellen, for taking the time. And absolutely, I found this book so provocative. And as I said, my book group is using it this coming month. And I really suggest that people buy it. It's just filled with just both your amazing studies, but just a lot of thought-provoking areas to think about that can really be so helpful for our own enjoyment of our own lives and living as fully as we can. Any final takeaway? I know you just wished everybody mindfulness, but any final takeaway? Or
that the bottommost line, if there is such a thing, is to exploit the power and uncertainty. Rather than think we know, they know, that the recognizing that nobody knows, everything is possible, should give us motivation to be out there in the world differently than many of us are right now. So again, basically add more life to your years and by being mindful, and at the least or at the most, I don't know which direction, that should add more years to our lives.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for being who you are and your own imagination, creativity, and scholarship that has led to all these amazing studies that just throws a lot of stuff on its head. And thank you for the Mind Body book, of Thinking Our Way to Chronic Health. Take care, everybody, and thanks so much again. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.